Niobrara Sandhills, Nebraska, October 1911. The wind had teeth, and it was only autumn. It scoured the low, rolling hills, stripping the last color from the bunch grass and leaving a landscape the color of bone and dust. On a small quarter section tucked into a shallow valley, Bálint Kovács was building something no one had ever seen. It wasn't the foundation, a simple packed earth floor ringed with stone. It wasn't even the skeleton, a series of curved iron arches that formed a long, semicircular tunnel, like a metal caterpillar cresting the hill. That was just a Quonset, a strange but not unheard-of structure. No, the madness began when the hay wagons arrived. For a week, Bálint and his two young children, Laszlo and Zsófia, hauled and stacked, not for livestock, not in a barn, but against the iron ribs of the house itself. They were building walls of prairie hay, 4 feet thick from the foundation to the ridgeline. Neighbors would slow their wagons on the track a half-mile away, staring at the growing, shaggy mound. It looked less like a home, and more like a gargantuan loaf of bread. Wendell Threadgill, a traveling cattle buyer whose territory spanned 4 counties, pulled his buggy up one afternoon, his face a mask of professional concern. He was a man who understood the physics of the plains, the unforgiving calculus of fire, wind, and cold. He watched Bálint wrestling a heavy bale into place, sweat plastering the Hungarian's dark hair to his forehead. "Kovács," Threadgill said, his voice carrying easily on the wind. He didn't get out of his buggy. "You know what that is? That's a tinderbox. That's a funeral pyre waiting for a spark." Jedediah Morse, whose own sod-walled house hunkered nearby, nodded in solemn agreement. "A man can't be too careful with hay, Bálint. One stray ember from that stovepipe you're planning, and it's all over." Bálint paused, wiping his brow with the back of a calloused hand. He looked at the two men, their faces etched with genuine, if condescending, worry. "It will be covered," he said, his English thick but clear. "And the straw is packed tight. No air." He turned and went back to his work, heaving another bale into position. Threadgill shook his head, a look of grim pity on his face. He'd seen foolish things on the frontier, but this was a new category of madness. He told Silas Croft at the general store later that week, "I lost a brother's barn and 20 head of prime stock to a hay fire in 2003. Started from a lantern hung 30 feet away. That Hungarian will burn his family out before the new year. It's a damned shame." The word spread. The strange structure on the Kovács quarter was known simply as Kovács's Folly, or more grimly, the Haystack Tomb. The community watched and waited for the inevitable tragedy. What did this Hungarian thatcher, this quiet man from the flat, wind-swept plains of the Alfeld, understand about the science of conductive resistance that generations of plainsmen, sodbusters, and ranchers had missed entirely? This story is about more than just a strange house. It's about the collision of two kinds of knowledge, the hard-won, practical wisdom of the frontier, and an ancient, craft-based understanding of natural materials. It's a story about how sometimes the most radical innovation comes from looking at the most common materials in a completely new way. I promise, if you stay with me, you will learn a fundamental principle of thermodynamics that is as relevant today as it was in the brutal winter of 1911. And if you've ever felt a draft in your own home, tell us in the comments what you think the biggest source of heat loss is. Stick around, and you might be surprised by the answer. Be sure to subscribe for more stories of forgotten frontier genius. Bálint Kovács was not a carpenter. He had never framed a wall, notched a log, or tarred a conventional roof in his life. He was not a mason, familiar with the slow, earthy logic of stone and mortar. He was a seplow, a thatcher, from a land so flat it made the Nebraska sandhills look like jagged mountains. On the great Hungarian plain, the Alfold, a man's wealth was not in timber, but in the vast seas of grain. For centuries, his people had built with the earth and the stalks that grew from it. His hands knew the language of straw. They understood the heft of a bound rye sheaf, a kevie. They knew how to layer them, overlap them, and bind them so tightly that they could turn back a decade of winter rains. He had spent his youth on scaffolds, his face buried in the dry, sweet-smelling world of rye, weaving golden coats for barns and byres that kept the livestock warm through the bitter Danubian winters. He understood in his bones that a thick coat of air-trapping straw was nature's most perfect insulator. He and his wife Ilona and their children, Laszlo and Zsofia, had arrived in Nebraska 2 years prior. They had bought their quarter section with nearly every penny they had and built what they were told to build, a small shack of pine planks and tar paper over a timber frame. It looked like every other homesteader's first shelter, and it was a torture chamber. Their first winter was a lesson in the brutality of the American plains. The memory of it was a physical ache in Balint's joints. He remembered the tin roof plates, shrinking in the ferocious cold, popping and banging all night with a sound like random rifle shots, each one making Ilona jump. He remembered the lard in its tin, set only a few feet from the potbelly stove, holding a firm thumbprint well past noon. The cold was a physical presence, a predator that lived inside the walls. Most of all, he remembered the floor. The thin pine boards, laid over open joists, offered no protection from the frozen earth beneath. The cold didn't just radiate up, it bit. It chewed through 2 pairs of thick wool socks, a constant gnawing pain in the soles of their feet. They ate their meals in coats and hats, their breath pluming in the air between bites. By March, they had burned through a mountain of precious cordwood and were sick, exhausted, and demoralized. Bálint swore he would not let his family endure another winter like that. He would build them a proper home, but he would not build it like an American. He would build it like a Hungarian. The failure of the standard frontier cabin was not a failure of effort, but a failure of physics. The plainsmen of the Niobrara sandhills were masters of their craft, but their craft was based on the materials at hand and the traditions they brought with them. A log cabin, the icon of the frontier, was a fortress of solid mass. It was strong against wind and snow, but it was a sieve for heat. A 12-inch thick pine log has an R value of about 15, a respectable number, but timber was scarce and expensive in the sandhills. Most settlers, like the Kovács family initially, built with milled planks. A wall made of 1-inch pine boards, a layer of tar paper, and another layer of interior planks might, if built perfectly, achieve an R value of 3 or 4. Against a gentle Virginia winter, it was adequate. Against a Nebraska blizzard, with temperatures plunging to 20 below and a 40-mile-per-hour wind driving it home, it was like trying to stop a flood with a bedsheet. The relentless laws of thermodynamics dictated that the heat from their stoves would pour through those thin walls as if they weren't there. Jedediah Morse, Balint's closest neighbor, lived in a sod house, the other great innovation of the plains. Cut from the earth itself, sod bricks, or Nebraska marble, were cheap, plentiful, and offered better insulation than wood. A 2-foot-thick sod wall could reach an R value of 20, a significant improvement. But sod houses had their own problems. They were damp, prone to leaks, and hosted a menagerie of insects, snakes, and rodents. In the deep freezes, the moisture trapped in the sod would turn to ice, conducting the cold straight through. Morse's family spent the winter huddled in the one room their stove could keep barely above freezing, burning through a staggering 8 cords of cottonwood. A full season's labor of cutting and hauling. The problem, Bálint saw, wasn't the cold. The cold was a constant. The problem was the container. These houses were designed to be strong, to be shelters from wind and snow. They were not designed to hold heat, a a form of energy, is always trying to move from a warmer place to a colder place. The pioneers fought this battle with fuel, endlessly feeding their stoves to replace the energy that was constantly escaping. Bálint knew there was another way. You didn't fight the leak. You built a better bucket. The construction began in late summer, a race against the first hard frost. Bálint bought the iron arches from a catalog, a surprising expense that made Ilona's brow furrow with worry. They cost $60, a significant portion of their savings. "It is the bones, Ilona," he explained. "The bones must be strong. The coat is cheap." He anchored the arches to his stone foundation, creating a long, sturdy tunnel, 80 feet long and 20 feet wide. This would be their entire world. Living quarters at one end, a space for their milk cow and chickens at the other, all under one roof. Then came the hay. He used the prairie hay he cut and baled himself from his own land. It wasn't the tight, dense rye straw of his homeland, but it was what he had. He calculated it would be enough. The bales were massive, nearly 4 feet long and 2 feet square, weighing close to 80 pounds each. He designed a simple block and tackle system, and with Laszlo guiding the ropes, he began to lay them like giant fibrous bricks against the iron skeleton. He worked with a methodical patience that baffled and frustrated his neighbors. He laid the first course all the way around the base, packing them as tightly as humanly possible. Then the second, offsetting the seams like a bricklayer. He was building a wall 4 feet thick, a solid mass of desiccated grass. It was during this phase that Wendell Threadgill made his visit. The cattle buyer was a respected figure, a man whose opinion carried weight. He didn't just see the hay. He saw a specific danger, rooted in personal tragedy. "Kovács," he said, stepping down from his buggy this time, his boots crunching on stray stalks of hay. "I'm telling you as a man who knows. My brother Daniel built the finest barn in Custer County, tight as a drum. He stored his winter hay in the loft. One night, a hired hand went up with a lantern. The coroner said the heat must have been so intense the glass cracked. One drop of burning oil on a single loose piece of hay." He paused, his gaze distant and pained. "They found buttons from his shirt 100 yards away. It went up like gunpowder. You have a stove in there. You have a metal stovepipe going right through this kindling." Bálint stopped his work. He looked at Threadgill, then at the wall he was building. He walked over to a bale, picked up a loose handful of hay, and held it out. "Air burns," he said simply. He dropped the loose hay to the ground. Then he gestured to the wall. No air, packed, very hard. He balled his fist and struck the wall of bales. It was like hitting packed earth. "No air," he repeated. Threadgill just shook his head and walked back to his buggy. The man was a fool. A stubborn, foreign fool who would get his family killed. For 3 more weeks, Bálint and his family worked. When the 4-foot-thick walls of hay reached the apex of the roof, completely encasing the iron arches, he began the final step. He purchased several enormous rolls of heavy canvas and gallons of pine tar. He and Ilona spent a week stitching the canvas into a single, massive skin. Then, with the help of a winch and several neighbors who came to watch the spectacle, they dragged the heavy tarred fabric over the entire structure. They secured it with ropes and stakes driven deep into the ground. When they were done, the building looked like a great black whale half buried in the prairie. The final touch was the entrance. A conventional door would be a gaping wound of heat loss. Instead, Bálint built a long, low tunnel, also made of hay bales, and covered in tarred canvas that projected 10 feet from the front of the structure. It had a heavy wood door at the outside end, and a thick blanket serving as a second door on the inside. It was a primitive airlock designed to keep the precious warmth of the interior from ever directly touching the outside air. By the first snowfall in November, it was complete. The mockery lasted the autumn. The validation would last a lifetime. To understand why Bálint Kovács's family was warm while his neighbors shivered, we have to understand the invisible enemy they were all fighting: conduction. Conduction is the transfer of heat through direct contact. When you touch a hot stove, the heat conducts directly into your hand. In a prairie winter, the warm air molecules inside a house are constantly bumping against the inner walls, transferring their energy. Those molecules in the wall transfer the energy to the next ones, and so on, until the heat reaches the outside wall and escapes into the cold air. The battle of winter is a battle against conduction. The effectiveness of a material at resisting this flow of heat is measured by its R value. The R stands for resistance. A higher R value means better insulation. The 1-inch pine boards on a typical homesteader's shack had an R value of about 1. An entire wall assembly might total R3 or R4. This is a very low number. The heat generated by a wood stove would conduct through these walls almost as fast as the stove could produce it. Bálint Kovács, the Hungarian thatcher, was a master of R value, even if he didn't know the term. He knew that the insulating champion of the natural world wasn't wood or earth or even solid straw. It was air. Specifically, it was trapped air. Millions of tiny, microscopic pockets of still air. The magic of a thick layer of straw or hay is that each hollow stalk and each tiny space between the stalks creates an air pocket. Heat, trying to conduct its way through, has to cross millions of these tiny barriers, losing energy at every step. A single inch of densely packed dry prairie hay has an R value of approximately 2. This was the crucial number. Wendell Threadgill looked at the hay and saw fuel. Bálint Kovács looked at it and saw a matrix of trapped air. His walls were not 4 feet of hay. They were 4 feet of still air, held in place by a cellulose skeleton. 48 inches of thickness, multiplied by an R value of 2 per inch, gave his home's walls an astonishing R value of 96. His ceiling, equally thick, was the same. A modern, well-insulated home today might have walls rated at R20 and a ceiling at R40. Bálint's hay bale Quonset had an R value more than double that of a modern luxury home built from materials he cut from his own land. The key, as he had tried to explain to Threadgill, was density. By packing the bales so tightly, he had eliminated the channels through which air, and therefore fire, could travel. The tarred canvas skin served not just as waterproofing, but as a final barrier against wind, preventing convective heat loss, where the wind physically carries heat away from a surface. He hadn't just built a shelter, he had engineered a system. That December, the sky cleared. For 16 straight days, it remained a brilliant, merciless blue. The wind died completely. On the plains, this was not a sign of relief, but of danger. Without the wind to stir the atmosphere, the heavier, colder air settled into the valleys and depressions of the sandhills like water filling a bowl. This was a cold air pool, a notorious sandhills weather event. The temperature plummeted. It dropped past 0, past 10 below, past 20. At the Morse homestead, the thermometer bottomed out at its limit of minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit and stayed there. The official reading in the nearby town of Valentine was minus 38 degrees Fahrenheit. For the settlers in their conventional cabins, it was a state of siege. The world outside went silent and deadly. Livestock froze, standing in the fields. The sap in trees froze solid, and trunks split open with a sound like a pistol shot in the still air. Inside the Morses' sod house, every nailhead on the interior walls was white with a thick cap of frost, miniature conduits of cold from the outside world. They burned wood at a frantic pace, but the stove could do little more than create a small bubble of survivable warmth in the center of their main room. They lived in that bubble, sleeping on the floor in a pile of blankets, their world shrunk to a few square feet. At the Kovács place, life went on. The silence outside was just silence. Inside the long curved space, the air was still and warm. A single small fire in the cast iron stove kept the entire 80-foot length of the structure at a comfortable 65 degrees. Bálint had to add a log only every few hours. They were consuming less than a quarter of the wood the Morse family was burning through. The proof of their comfort was in the small domestic details that extreme cold normally renders impossible. Ilona spent the afternoons baking bread. The rich, yeasty smell filled the warm air, a scent of profound and impossible normalcy. The windows, small panes, set deep into the hay walls, remained clear of frost, except for a little ice at the very edges. The family's cat, which in the old cabin had spent the winter permanently curled on the warmest part of the stove, was stretched out languidly on a rug in the middle of the floor, basking in the general, even warmth. Laszlo and Zsófia, their children, were not huddled in blankets. They lay on their stomachs on the smooth, packed earth floor, drawing on slate boards, their coats and hats hung on pegs by the door. They were living, not just surviving. The cold wasn't a predator inside their walls. It was just weather, somewhere far away, on the other side of a 4-foot coat of hay. In the third week of the deep cold, Wendell Threadgill lost a heifer. She was a prize, pregnant with her first calf, and had broken through a fence in the night. For 2 days, he tracked her across his frozen pasture, his hope dwindling with every passing hour. In this cold, a stray animal was a dead animal. The tracks led him west, toward the Niobrara River, onto land he didn't often cross. He was cold-soaked and exhausted, his face numb under his scarf, his mustache a solid block of ice. The landscape was alien, a uniform white under 2 feet of hard, crusted snow. He crested a low rise, and his eyes, raw from the wind and cold, struggled to make sense of what he was seeing. Below him, in a shallow dip, was Kovács's Folly. The long, black mound was half buried in drifted snow. But something was wrong. Something was impossible. Around the base of the structure, where the black tarred walls met the snow, was a perfect ring of vivid, shocking green. And in that ring of green, contentedly chewing her cud in a patch of thawed, living grass, was his lost heifer. Threadgill urged his horse down the slope, his mind refusing to accept the evidence of his eyes. As he got closer, the phenomenon became clearer. A circle of ground, about 10 feet wide, wrapped around the entire base of the hay house. The snow had completely melted, revealing the dormant prairie grass beneath. But it wasn't dormant. Near the base of the hay wall, new spring shoots stood 3 inches tall, a vibrant, impossible green against the vast frozen white of the sandhills. He dismounted, his boots sinking not into iron-hard frozen earth, but into soft, damp turf. He had been walking on ground that rang like steel for 2 weeks. This felt like May. He reached down and touched a blade of grass. It was real, cold, but pliable and alive. He walked to the wall of the house itself. He had expected to feel a biting, radiating cold from the surface. He placed his bare, gloved hand on the tarred canvas. He felt nothing. No cold. If anything, there was a faint, almost imperceptible warmth leaking through. That was the moment he understood. The house wasn't a perfect container. It couldn't be. It was leaking a tiny, steady amount of heat, waste heat, conducted slowly through 4 feet of hay. But instead of bleeding uselessly into the vast, cold sky, it was warming the ground immediately around it, creating a microclimate. It was creating a tiny, artificial spring in the heart of a killing winter. His heifer hadn't found shelter by accident. She had been drawn by the smell of living grass, by the promise of thawed earth. She was safe not in spite of the strange house, but because of it. He walked to the tunnel entrance, his mind reeling. The skeptic in him, the man who had lost his brother's barn, was gone. In his place was a man humbled by a truth so simple and profound, it felt like a revelation. Bálint Kovács emerged from the tunnel, alerted by the horse. He saw Threadgill, saw the heifer, and a slow look of understanding dawned on his face. Threadgill gestured toward the ring of green grass, his throat too tight with cold and awe to speak at first. "Kovács," he finally managed, his voice raspy. "How?" Bálint looked at the green grass, then at his home. He shrugged, as if the answer were the most obvious thing in the world. "The house, it breathes a little," he said. "Keeps the ground warm." Threadgill stood there for a long moment, the frozen world stretching to the horizon in every direction, and this one impossible circle of life at his feet. He looked at the house, then back at the quiet Hungarian. "You didn't build a house, Kovács," Threadgill said, the words forming slowly as the idea took shape. "You built a season." Wendell Threadgill led his heifer home, but he was a changed man. The image of that green circle was burned into his mind. That evening, in his own frigid ranch house, he took out his stock purchase ledger, a thick, leather-bound book filled with the names, weights, and prices of cattle. In the back, on a blank page, he sketched. With a cold-numbed hand and a pencil stub, he drew a half circle. He drew lines indicating the iron arches, then sketched in the cross-section of the hay bale walls, carefully writing 4 feet thick, packed tight, and underlining it twice. He drew the tarred canvas skin and the tunnel entrance. It was the crude drawing of a cattleman, not an architect, but it captured the essential genius of the design. Threadgill's business took him to every corner of the Niobrara region. At every ranch, every homestead where he stopped to inspect stock, he told the story. At first, they were as skeptical as he had been. A house of hay? In a land where prairie fires could run for 100 miles? But Threadgill was not some wild-eyed eccentric. He was a sober, respected businessman. And he had the drawing. He would open his ledger on a fence post or a kitchen table and talk them through it. He told them about the 16 days of minus 38 degrees Fahrenheit, about his own shivering family, and about the Kovács children playing on the floor in their socks. He told them about his lost heifer, but the detail that broke through their skepticism, time and again, was the ring of green grass. It was an image so powerful, so contrary to their entire experience of a Sandhills winter, that it forced them to reconsider what they thought they knew. He showed the drawing to Abe Finch, a rancher who had lost a third of his herd to the deep cold. Finch stared at the drawing for a long time, then went to his barn and struck a bale of hay with his fist, just as Kovács had done. He felt its stony solidity. The next spring, Finch built the second haystack house in the Sandhills. By the following autumn, there were 7 more. Families began to modify the design, using a double course of sod bricks on the outside for added fire protection, or building with flax straw, which they claimed packed even tighter. The idea spread not through any official channel, but through a cattleman's ledger and the desperate need for a better way to survive. The knowledge passed from neighbor to neighbor, a practical gospel of warmth and efficiency. What Bálint Kovács built on his small quarter section in 1911 was a century ahead of its time. He had created, out of the most humble materials imaginable, a super-insulated structure. Today, the principles he used are at the cutting edge of sustainable building science. Modern straw bale construction, a growing movement in eco-friendly architecture, uses the same logic. Thick walls of a renewable, agricultural byproduct to create exceptionally high R values. Architects and engineers now talk about thermal mass, air tightness, and passive solar design. But these are just technical terms for the deep, intuitive knowledge a Hungarian thatcher brought to the Nebraska plains. Bálint Kovács didn't have the vocabulary of a modern engineer, but he had a perfect understanding of the result. He knew that a thick coat of trapped air was the most effective barrier against the cold, and he had the courage to build on that knowledge, even in the face of universal ridicule. In the end, the story of Kovács's Folly is a story about two ways of seeing the world. The frontiersman saw the prairie as an adversary. He built a fortress to protect himself from its brutal extremes. His walls were a declaration of war against the cold, a war he was destined to lose, or at least pay for with endless cords of wood and shivering nights. Bálint Kovács did not see an enemy. He saw a resource. He didn't wall out the cold. He grew a coat around his house and let it breathe. His home was not a rigid, brittle fortress. It was an organic, yielding buffer, working in harmony with its environment. It acknowledged the power of the cold, but answered it with the quiet, resilient strength of the earth itself. The ultimate proof of his wisdom was not just that his family was warm, but that his house gave a little of its life-sustaining warmth back to the frozen ground around it, creating that impossible ring of green. He showed his neighbors that the solution to their hardest problem wasn't to be found in fighting nature, but in understanding its materials, respecting its laws, and weaving them into a shelter that was as much a part of the landscape as the grass from which it was made. Thank you for joining us for this story of frontier ingenuity. If you found this exploration of historical engineering as fascinating as we do, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more stories like this one. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever seen an example of old-world knowledge solving a modern problem? Let us know. Disclaimer: this video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, but the techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices. The application of any building technique today should be done in accordance with modern building codes, safety guidelines, and professional consultation. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.